Hey guys, tonight let's slow everything way down. Dim the lights, put the phone face down, loosen your jaw. Because tonight we're drifting gently into one of history's least relaxing topics, but we're going to talk about it in the calmest, sleepiest way possible. Tonight, we're talking about what really happens to women accused of witchcraft, not the movie version. Not the dramatic bonfires and shouting crowds you've seen 100 times, but the long, boring, bureaucratic, emotionally draining reality. The paperwork, the waiting, the accusations that started with something as thrilling as, "My butter won't churn." So settle in. This is a story that moves slowly, painfully slowly, much like justice did at the time. Now, before we meet any specific woman, we need to understand something important. Witch hunts weren't one event. They weren't one place. They weren't even one century. They were a vibe, a very bad vibe. They happened across Europe. They happened in colonial America. They peaked at different times in different regions. And most importantly, they were not led by mobs of screaming villagers most of the time. They were led by courts, by educated men, by officials who thought they were being very reasonable, which, honestly, is the most uncomfortable part. Now let's gently float back to medieval and early modern Europe. Life is already unpleasant. You're cold. You're hungry. Everyone smells faintly of smoke and regret. Medicine is mostly guessing, science is still warming up, and religion is doing most of the explaining. When something goes wrong, it's not random, it's not bacteria, it's not bad luck, it's someone's fault. And society had a very specific list of people it liked to blame. At the top of that list were women, especially women who lived alone, women who didn't marry, women who survived their husbands, women who knew how to make herbal remedies, because knowing things is suspicious, obviously. Now, here's the part that tends to get skipped in dramatic retellings. Most accusations did not start with screaming. They started with gossip. Quiet, slow gossip. A neighbor mentions that her child fell ill after visiting another woman's house. Someone else remembers that the same woman argued with them last winter. Another person recalls that she owns a black cat. And suddenly, a pattern exists. Not a real one, but one that feels convincing if you squint and you're already anxious. And anxiety was everywhere. Crop failures, plagues, infant mortality, wars that never seemed to end. People wanted control. They wanted answers. And accusing a woman of witchcraft gave them both. Now let's talk about what happened once an accusation stuck, because this is where the boredom really kicks in. There was paperwork, there were statements, there were hearings. A woman accused of witchcraft was usually arrested quietly, no dramatic chase, no flames yet. She was taken to a local jail, which was not great. Cold. Dark, often underground. And then she waited. Days, weeks, sometimes months, not knowing what evidence existed, not knowing who had spoken against her. And here's the thing. In many legal systems at the time, the accusation itself was considered evidence, which is convenient. Now, interrogations were long, very long. Not always violent at first, often repetitive. The same questions again and again. Do you practice witchcraft? No. Are you sure? Yes. Are you absolutely sure? This could go on for hours. Sleep deprivation was common, because if you're tired enough, you'll say almost anything. And many women eventually did. They confessed. Not because they were witches, but because they were human and exhausted. Now, here's a quiet, deeply sad detail. Many women who confessed didn't even fully understand what they were confessing to. They repeated stories suggested to them, stories they had heard in church, stories described by interrogators, flying at night, meeting the devil, casting spells. And once a confession existed, the legal system felt very satisfied with itself. Of course she confessed. Case closed. But what about the women who didn't confess? Well, that didn't always help either. Silence could be interpreted as guilt, resistance as stubbornness. Because if you were innocent, you'd obviously confess and let God sort it out. Logic was not having its best era. Now let's gently correct one popular myth. Not all accused women were executed. Some were imprisoned for life. Some were banished. Some were released after years when public interest faded. And yes, in rare cases, some were later declared innocent. Which sounds hopeful, until you look at what innocent meant. Being proven innocent often happened years later, sometimes decades, after witnesses recanted, after courts admitted procedural errors, after society moved on to new fears. By then, the woman's life was usually gone anyway. Her home was lost, her reputation destroyed, her family broken. In some places, innocence came with no apology, no compensation, just a quiet note in a record book. Charges dismissed. Which is history's version of a shrug. Now, let's gently float over to the social aftermath. Because even when a woman survived an accusation, she rarely returned to a normal life. Neighbors avoided her. Children were warned about her. She became a living reminder of danger, of chaos, and that label didn't fade easily. In fact, many women accused once were accused later again because suspicion sticks. Now, here's something that doesn't get talked about enough. Men were accused of witchcraft too, but not often, and not in the same way. Men were usually accused when they were political threats, or when accusations were useful. Women were accused for existing incorrectly, being poor, being outspoken, being old, being young and unmarried, being inconvenient. And the courts let this happen. Not because everyone was evil, but because the system rewarded certainty over doubt, and witchcraft provided certainty. Now, let's take a breath here, because this story isn't about fire and screaming. It's about waiting, waiting in cells, waiting for judgment, waiting for neighbors to decide your fate. It's about how fear becomes routine, how cruelty becomes administrative, and how innocence becomes irrelevant when society needs someone to blame. In later centuries, as science improved and legal standards changed, courts slowly stopped accepting witchcraft accusations, not because people suddenly became kinder, but because the evidence didn't hold up, which is progress, technically. Some governments even issued formal apologies centuries later. Statues were erected, memorials placed, which is something. But it doesn't undo the boredom of suffering, the slow erosion of a life. Now, as we drift toward the next part of this story, we'll start meeting specific women. Not heroes, not villains, just people. People who lived ordinary lives until history quietly decided they were a problem. So stay relaxed. Let your mind wander. In the next part, we'll gently move into individual cases, not with drama, not with shock, just with facts, and a little dry commentary. Because if history teaches us anything, it's that terrible things often happen very calmly. And on that cozy note,
all right, let's gently continue. No sudden noises, no sharp turns. Just a slow drift back into the lives of women who absolutely did not wake up one morning planning to become historical case studies. Because that's the thing. Most women accused of witchcraft were painfully ordinary. Not mysterious, not dramatic, not brewing potions under moonlight. They were cooking, cleaning, surviving, and sometimes they were just unlucky. Let's start with a very common type, the widow. Ah, yes, the medieval and early modern widow, a woman whose husband had inconveniently died, often from war or disease or falling off something tall. Now suddenly she owned property, or money, or at least control over her own life, which was, of course, suspicious. Widows were independent by accident, and independence made people uncomfortable. She didn't answer to a man anymore. She made her own decisions. She didn't fit neatly into the social order, so people watched her more closely. If a widow argued with a neighbor, that argument was remembered. If she refused charity, that was remembered too. If she accepted charity, well, also suspicious, because apparently you could not win. Now imagine this widow lives alone, maybe at the edge of town, maybe near the woods, not because she's spooky, but because land is cheaper there. Already the rumors begin to form. She keeps to herself. She mutters sometimes. She has strange herbs hanging in her house. The herbs, by the way, are usually for medicine, because doctors are expensive and mostly useless. But knowing how to treat a fever, very dangerous knowledge. Now let's talk about healers. Women who practiced folk medicine were incredibly common. They were midwives, herbalists, caretakers. They helped deliver babies. They treated wounds. They eased pain. And people trusted them until something went wrong. And something always went wrong eventually. A baby died. A wound became infected. A sickness didn't improve. And suddenly the healer's skills were questioned. Because if she could heal, maybe she could also harm, which is a fascinating logical leap. Now let's slowly walk into an actual case. We won't rush, no need. In 16th century Germany, a woman named Katharina lived a very unremarkable life. She was older, poor, and known for being unpleasant. Not evil, just sharp-tongued. She argued with neighbors. She complained loudly. She didn't suffer fools quietly, which is apparently the worst crime of all. When misfortune struck her village, failed crops, sick animals, people remembered every argument she'd ever had, and those arguments became evidence. She cursed me. She threatened me. Threats that probably sounded like, "Go away and leave me alone." But once fear takes over, tone is everything. Katharina was arrested, interrogated, asked again and again to confess. She didn't, which prolonged everything. Her case dragged on for months, then years. And here's where things get particularly dull and cruel. Nothing happened. She sat in prison, waiting. Her health declined. She grew weaker. Eventually, she died. Not executed, not dramatically punished, just forgotten. And later, records quietly noted that there had been no proof, which is history's version of saying, well, that was awkward. Now let's float over to England. English witch trials were, interestingly, less deadly than those on the continent. Still terrible, just administratively terrible. English courts were obsessed with procedures, which sounds comforting, but wasn't. Accused women were examined for witches' marks, which could be anything: a mole, a scar, a birthmark. Human bodies are very inconvenient that way. If no mark was found, they kept looking, because clearly it was hiding. Now imagine being a poor woman, undressed, inspected by strangers, while officials debated whether your freckles were satanic. Relaxing experience. Some women passed these examinations and were released, proven innocent. But that didn't mean free. Their names were still associated with witchcraft. Jobs were lost, social ties broken. In small communities, reputation was everything, and witchcraft accusations were permanent stains. Now let's talk about the women who were actually acquitted. Because yes, it happened. Sometimes courts concluded that evidence was weak. Witnesses contradicted each other. Confessions were withdrawn. And judges, tired and bored, dismissed the case. The woman was allowed to go home. But what home? Her house might have been seized, her belongings sold, her family scattered. Returning meant facing neighbors who had testified against her, and neighbors who wondered if the court got it wrong. Because courts make mistakes, but witches don't. At least that's what people thought. Now let's drift across the ocean. Slowly. No splashing. Colonial America. Yes, Salem is coming, but we won't rush there, because before Salem, accusations were already happening. Puritan communities were rigid, strict, deeply anxious. They believed the world was a battlefield between God and the devil, and they believed the devil was very interested in New England real estate. Women who didn't conform were watched, women who spoke too much, women who didn't attend church properly, women who were poor and asked for help. If a woman begged and was refused, and something bad later happened, that refusal was remembered. She was angry. She muttered under her breath, and just like that, another accusation was born. Now let's talk about one of the most uncomfortable truths. Some women accused of witchcraft accused others, not out of cruelty, but survival. When pressured, some women named names, not because they believed those women were witches, but because naming someone else delayed their own punishment. Fear does that to people, and courts encouraged it. Confessions were valuable if they included accomplices, because witches apparently never worked alone, which turned communities inward. Trust collapsed, friendships ended, and later, when hysteria passed, everyone quietly pretended it hadn't happened. Now here's a detail that tends to surprise people. Some women accused of witchcraft were literate, and that made things worse. Reading was power. Writing was power. And women with power made authorities nervous. A woman who could read religious texts herself might question interpretations. A woman who could write might record events, which is inconvenient if you prefer silence. Now let's gently pause here, because this part of the story isn't loud. It's not dramatic. It's repetitive. Accusation, arrest, waiting, interrogation, release, or death. Over and over. Across countries, across centuries. Different names, same pattern. And for the women who were later proven innocent, history rarely followed up. Their innocence existed only in records, in dusty archives, not in their lived experience. They didn't get their years back. They didn't get their peace back. They got silence, which, ironically, is what makes their stories perfect for this channel, because silence is where history often hides its worst habits. Now, as we gently prepare to move into part 3, we'll start focusing on how witch trials slowly declined, not because humanity became enlightened overnight, but because systems changed. Evidence standards shifted, science improved, fear found new targets. So don't worry, no sudden optimism, just a slow, boring transition into legal reforms, skeptical judges, and societies quietly realizing they'd gone a bit too far. So take a deep breath, adjust your pillow. We're drifting onward.
All right. Still with me? Good. Let's keep everything exactly the same speed. Nothing sudden, nothing exciting. Just a slow historical realization that maybe, just maybe, accusing half the population of supernatural crimes wasn't a flawless system. Now, witch trials did not end because everyone woke up one day feeling bad. That would be nice, but no. They ended because doubt crept in, quietly, awkwardly. And doubt is very annoying to systems built on certainty. Let's start with the judges, because eventually even they got tired. Imagine being a local magistrate in the 1600s. You've heard 50 witch cases. They all sound the same. A woman argued with a neighbor, something bad happened, someone had a dream. Confession extracted, another confession copied from the first. At some point, even the most enthusiastic witch hunter starts to notice the repetition. Not because they suddenly care deeply about justice, but because it's boring. And judges, historically, hate boring cases. Some judges began asking inconvenient questions. Where is the actual evidence? Why does every confession sound identical? Why does torture make people say whatever we want them to say? Which, yes, excellent questions. About a century late, but still. Now let's float over to the legal side of things. In many parts of Europe, legal standards slowly began to change. Courts started requiring physical evidence. Witness credibility mattered more. And witchcraft cases did not handle that transition well. Because spells leave no fingerprints. Curses don't show up in court. And accusing someone because your goat died suddenly seemed less persuasive. In England, skepticism arrived earlier than in many places. English judges became increasingly uncomfortable with spectral evidence. Spectral evidence, by the way, is when someone says, "Her ghost attacked me in a dream," which is not ideal legally. By the mid-1600s, English courts were quietly backing away from witch trials. Not loudly, no announcements. They just stopped taking them seriously. And without court support, accusations lost power. Now, let's drift back to colonial America. Because yes, Salem. But again, calmly. The Salem witch trials didn't end because hysteria peaked dramatically. They ended because the system broke under its own weight. Too many accusations, too many respected people involved, too many contradictions. When ministers and officials themselves were accused, suddenly skepticism bloomed. Funny how that works. Eventually, colonial authorities admitted spectral evidence was unreliable. Executions stopped. Trials ended. And then came the apologies. Quiet ones. Awkward ones. Some accusers recanted. Some judges expressed regret. Years later, some victims were officially exonerated. Their names were cleared. Posthumously. Which is not particularly helpful to them, but very comforting to history. Now let's talk about what proven innocent actually meant. Because it did not mean vindication in the modern sense. It meant the court decided the case was invalid, or that procedures were flawed, or that evidence was insufficient. It did not mean the woman was publicly celebrated. It did not mean her accusers were punished. In fact, accusers were almost never held accountable, because acknowledging wrongdoing would mean acknowledging the system failed, and systems hate that. Some women received small financial compensation, years later. Others received nothing. Many had already died. Now let's slow down and sit with that. A woman survives imprisonment, survives interrogation, survives public suspicion. She is released, declared innocent. And then she goes back to living next to the same people who accused her. Same streets, same church, same whispers. In some communities, she was treated cautiously. In others, she was shunned. Because innocence on paper does not erase fear in people's minds. Now let's talk about memory. How societies remembered witch trials, or didn't. For a long time, witch hunts were embarrassing. They didn't fit the narrative of progress, so they were minimized, dismissed as superstition. People preferred to believe they were brief episodes of mass hysteria, rather than long-term systemic failures. Which brings us to modern reinterpretations. In the 19th and 20th centuries, historians began revisiting these cases, reading trial records, studying testimonies, and slowly a clearer picture emerged. These women were not witches. They were victims of fear, of misogyny, of social pressure, but also of boredom. Fear thrives when nothing else explains suffering, and suffering was constant. Now, here's a quiet, uncomfortable truth. Witch hunts didn't disappear everywhere at once. In some regions, accusations continued into the 18th century, even the 19th. And in parts of the world, witchcraft accusations still exist today. Different forms, different systems, same logic. Which means this story isn't entirely over. It just changed costumes. Now, let's talk briefly about how modern memorials handle this history. Many towns have plaques, monuments, quiet acknowledgments. They list names, dates. They say things like, "in memory of those wrongly accused," which is good, but also very late. These memorials are often placed far from town centers, out of the way, because remembering injustice is uncomfortable, and discomfort ruins tourism. Now, as a historian, there's always a temptation to end this story with a lesson, something hopeful, something reassuring. But tonight, we won't do that, because the real lesson is boring. Systems don't fail loudly, they fail slowly. They fail politely with paperwork. And the women accused of witchcraft were caught inside that failure. They weren't symbols, they weren't warnings. They were people who lived ordinary lives until fear decided they were expendable. Now, as we prepare to drift into part 4, we'll begin looking at how later generations rebranded these women, how they became icons, feminist symbols, Halloween costumes, and how that transformation sometimes misses the point. So settle back, let your thoughts wander. History isn't screaming at us tonight, it's whispering.
All right. Welcome back. Same pace, same volume, nothing dramatic. If anything, this part might be even calmer, because now we're talking about what happened after everything already happened, which is where history usually gets a little awkward. So let's gently continue. By the time witch trials began fading out, societies didn't really know what to do with the aftermath. There was no big meeting, no official moment where everyone agreed to reflect deeply and feel bad together. Instead, things just moved on. New laws came in, new fears replaced old ones. Witchcraft quietly exited the courtroom and entered the category of things we no longer talk about at dinner. For a long time, accused women simply vanished from public memory. Their names remained in records, their stories stayed buried in archives, and that silence lasted for centuries. Now here's where it gets interesting, and slightly ironic. In the 18th and 19th centuries, as Enlightenment thinking gained popularity, witch trials became an embarrassment. People looked back and said things like, well, obviously everyone back then was irrational, which is a very comforting belief, because it suggests we are immune to similar mistakes. Spoiler alert, we are not. But during this period, accused women were often portrayed as foolish victims of superstition, not as individuals, just as examples. They were used to show how far society had progressed, which sounds respectful, but also quietly dismissive. Now let's float into the 20th century. This is when things shift again. Historians, especially social historians, started reading trial records more carefully, not just to study witchcraft, but to study women. And suddenly, these accused women weren't abstract anymore. They had voices, complaints, personal conflicts. They argued with neighbors. They struggled with poverty. They lived complicated, emotional lives. In other words, they were people. And this is when reinterpretation began. Some scholars reframed accused women as symbols of patriarchal oppression. Others saw them as victims of class conflict. Some focused on religious extremism. All of these interpretations had merit. But something subtle happened along the way. The women themselves slowly turned into symbols, icons, representations, which is better than being forgotten, but still not quite the same as being understood. Now let's gently talk about modern culture. Today, witches are everywhere. Books, movies, Halloween costumes. The witch has become powerful, independent, rebellious. And that's not inherently bad. But here's the quiet problem. Most women accused of witchcraft were not rebels. They weren't resisting systems. They weren't practicing secret power. They were surviving. They weren't trying to challenge society. They were trying to live inside it. And when we turn them into bold symbols of resistance, we sometimes erase their vulnerability, their fear, their confusion, their very human desire to just be left alone. Now, this doesn't mean modern reinterpretations are wrong. They serve a purpose. But they often smooth out the boring, uncomfortable details, the waiting, the paperwork, the endless questioning. The fact that many women never understood why this was happening to them. There's no cinematic monologue in the records, no dramatic speech before judgment, just simple statements like, "I don't know why they say this," which is somehow much sadder. Now let's talk about exonerations, the modern kind. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, several governments officially exonerated women accused of witchcraft centuries earlier. Switzerland, Scotland, parts of Germany. Names were cleared, records amended, ceremonies were held, speeches made. And again, this is good, but also symbolic. Because no amount of legal correction changes what those women lived through. Exoneration doesn't give back lost years. It doesn't restore children taken away. It doesn't erase isolation. It mostly serves the present. It allows modern societies to say, we recognize this was wrong, which is important, but incomplete. Now here's another uncomfortable layer. Some communities resisted exoneration efforts because acknowledging injustice meant acknowledging ancestors' actions, and people don't love that. It's easier to say that was a different time than to say we benefited from a system that harmed others. So memory remains selective. Now let's slow things down even further, because this part of the story isn't about courts or accusations anymore. It's about storytelling. Who gets remembered and how? When we tell witch trial stories today, we often focus on extremes, the loudest cases, the most dramatic trials. Salem, Würzburg, Bamberg. But most accusations happened quietly, in small towns, with no surviving portraits, women whose names appear once in a ledger, then never again. And that's where the real history sits, in the margins, in the cases that didn't make it into textbooks, the women who weren't executed but weren't restored either, the women who survived and lived the rest of their lives under a cloud of suspicion. That's not cinematic, but it's accurate. Now, as a historian, this is usually where people expect a conclusion, a summary, a lesson. But we won't do that yet, because there's still one more slow turn left. In the next part, we'll look at why witchcraft accusations were so effective as a social weapon, why they worked, why they spread, and why similar patterns keep repeating under different names. No drama, no modern panic. Just a calm examination of how fear organizes itself. So take another breath. Let your thoughts drift. History isn't finished with us yet.
All right, let's keep going. Same calm pace, same low energy. This part is a little longer, not because it's more exciting, but because it explains something quietly unsettling. Why witchcraft accusations worked so well, why they spread so easily, and why societies kept returning to them again and again, like a bad habit no one wanted to fully admit they had. Now, to understand this, we need to stop thinking about witch trials as superstition, because superstition alone doesn't explain scale. Fear does. Structure does, convenience does. Witchcraft accusations were effective because they solved multiple problems at once, and societies love efficient solutions, even terrible ones. First problem, uncertainty. Early modern life was filled with it. People did not understand disease, weather, mental illness. All right, let's keep going. Same calm pace, same low energy. This part is a little longer,
Not because it's more exciting, but because it explains something quietly unsettling. Why witchcraft accusations worked so well, why they spread so easily, and why societies kept returning to them again and again, like a bad habit no one wanted to fully admit they had. Now, to understand this, we need to stop thinking about witch trials as superstition, because superstition alone doesn't explain scale. Fear does, structure does, convenience does. Witchcraft accusations were effective because they solved multiple problems at once, and societies love efficient solutions, even terrible ones. First problem, uncertainty. Early modern life was filled with it. People did not understand disease, weather, mental illness, infertility, sudden death. When something went wrong, there was no satisfying explanation, and uncertainty is uncomfortable. Witchcraft replaced uncertainty with narrative. Something happened because someone did something. There was a cause, there was intent. That alone made people feel calmer, even if the explanation was horrifying. Second problem, social tension. Communities were tight-knit. Everyone depended on everyone else, which sounds cozy, but it wasn't. Poverty, inheritance disputes, personal grudges, these things piled up quietly. Witchcraft accusations gave people a socially acceptable outlet for conflict. You couldn't say, "I don't like her," but you could say, "She made my child sick." And suddenly, your personal resentment became a moral duty, which is incredibly powerful. Now let's talk about gender. Slowly, calmly, because this is not about women being weak, it's about women being positioned as expendable. Most accused women sat at the intersection of vulnerability. They were poor, or widowed, or elderly, or socially isolated. They lacked protectors. In patriarchal systems, protection mattered more than innocence. If a woman had a powerful family, accusations stalled. If she didn't, things moved very quickly. Now here's something especially uncomfortable. Witchcraft accusations also reinforced social norms. They punished deviation. A woman who spoke too much, a woman who refused charity, a woman who demanded payment. All of these behaviors challenged expectations of female obedience and gratitude. Accusations reminded everyone else to behave quietly, properly. And fear is an excellent teacher. Now let's talk about authority. Churches and courts benefited from witchcraft accusations, not intentionally always, but structurally. They positioned authorities as protectors against hidden threats. The devil was invisible. Witches were secretive. Only institutions could identify them, which reinforced trust in those institutions. If a judge said someone was guilty, questioning that judgment felt dangerous, spiritually, socially, so people didn't. Now let's slow down and talk about confession culture. Confessions were the gold standard of proof, and they were everywhere. Not because people were guilty, but because pressure works. Long interrogations, sleep deprivation, psychological stress. People confess to end suffering. And once confessions existed, they validated the system. See, they admitted it. Never mind how. Now here's the part that often surprises people. Witch hunts weren't chaotic. They were organized. Records were kept. Processes followed. That organization made them seem legitimate, which is far more dangerous than chaos. Now let's gently widen the lens, because witchcraft accusations did not disappear. They evolved. As belief in magic declined, societies found new invisible threats: heresy, political subversion, moral corruption. Different words, same structure. Identify a hidden enemy. Attach blame for uncertainty. Use authority to control fear. And once again, certain groups are targeted more than others. Now let's talk about innocence. In witch trials, innocence was passive. It required belief from others. It was not something a woman could prove herself. And that's crucial. When innocence depends on belief rather than evidence, it becomes fragile, and fear shatters fragile things easily. Now here's the quietest, heaviest part of this section. Many women accused of witchcraft never understood the accusation itself. They didn't see themselves as suspicious. They didn't recognize the social patterns forming around them. They were confused, and confusion isolates. Isolation makes defense impossible. Now, why does all this matter? Because when we talk about what really happened to women accused of witchcraft, we're not just talking about events, we're talking about mechanisms. How fear organizes people, how authority legitimizes harm, how ordinary grievances become moral crusades, and how systems rarely stop themselves. They fade, they transform, they wait for new language. Now let's slow the pace again, because we're nearing the end of the long arc. In the next part, we'll gently bring everything together. Not with conclusions, not with lessons shouted loudly, but with reflection. On why remembering these women accurately matters, and why boredom, silence, and routine cruelty are the most important details of all. So, stay relaxed, stay comfortable. History isn't warning us, it's calmly explaining itself.
All right. This is the last long drift. So get comfortable. Adjust your pillow. Let your breathing slow down a bit. Because part 6 isn't about events anymore. It's about memory. And memory, as history goes, is surprisingly quiet. When we ask what really happened to women accused of witchcraft, we often expect an ending, a moral resolution, a sense of closure. But history almost never gives us that. What it gives us instead is continuation. The women accused of witchcraft did not step out of their trials into meaning. They stepped back into life, or what was left of it. And that's where the story usually fades out. Not because nothing happened, but because nothing dramatic happened. Most women who survived witchcraft accusations lived afterward in a kind of historical silence. They didn't write memoirs. They didn't give interviews. They went back to work, if work was still available. They went back to families, if families still spoke to them. They went back to houses, if houses still belonged to them. And many of them lived under a permanent, invisible label. Not witch, but that woman. The one people watched. The one people avoided. The one children were warned about quietly. And here's the thing. History rarely records that part, because it doesn't know how. Now let's slow this down even more. Imagine surviving an accusation. Not triumphantly, not proudly, just barely. You've learned something terrible. That innocence doesn't protect you. That reputation is fragile. That neighbors remember fear longer than facts. And you carry that knowledge quietly, every day. There is no ceremony for that. No archival category called lives permanently altered but not destroyed. So these women disappear from the story, which is why later generations had so much freedom to reinterpret them. When 19th century writers rediscovered witch trials, they romanticized them. They turned accused women into tragic figures, sometimes mystical, sometimes noble, which sounds respectful, but it often stripped away realism, because tragedy is cleaner than reality.
reality includes boredom, poverty, isolation, and the uncomfortable fact that many accused women were not remarkable in any obvious way. They didn't stand for something. They were standing there when fear needed a target. Now let's talk about modern remembrance. Museums, documentaries, YouTube channels like this one. All of them try in different ways to give these women their humanity. But there's always a risk. The risk of overcorrecting, turning them into symbols of resistance, of empowerment, of secret strength. And again, that's not wrong, but it can quietly erase the most important truth. Most of these women did not feel powerful. They felt confused, tired, scared, and sometimes ashamed. Because when an entire community insists you are something terrible, doubt creeps in, even if you know you're innocent. Now let's sit with that for a moment. The psychological weight of accusation. Long before execution, long before imprisonment, the accusation itself was a punishment. People looked at you differently, spoke to you differently, and that change never fully reversed. Even after acquittal, even after exoneration. This is why official apologies centuries later feel both necessary and insufficient. They acknowledge injustice, but they don't recreate social trust. Trust, once broken, does not travel well through time. Now here's a quieter observation. The women accused of witchcraft were not unique victims of history. They were early examples of a recurring pattern. Identify a hidden threat, attach it to visible people, use fear to justify harm. The names change, the logic stays. And this is where remembering accurately matters. Not loudly, not theatrically, but honestly. Because if we only remember witch trials as madness or superstition, we miss the structure. We miss how normal it all felt to the people involved. Records showed judges going home for dinner after sentencing, neighbors attending church together after testifying against someone. Life went on, which is the most disturbing detail of all. Now let's return to the women themselves. One last time. They did not leave behind manifestos. They left behind fragments, names, ages, occupations. Occasionally a sentence spoken in court. I don't know why this is happening. I lived quietly. I harmed no one. That's it. No speeches, no legacy management. Just the hope that someone, someday, would read the record carefully. And that is quietly what we are doing now. Not rescuing them, not rewriting them, just listening. Now before we drift out, there's one final thing worth mentioning. History doesn't need villains to function. It needs permission. Permission to overlook, to rationalize, to prioritize comfort over justice. And witchcraft accusations thrived in that permission. They were rarely questioned because questioning them was inconvenient, socially, politically, emotionally. It was easier to accept the story than disrupt the system. And that is why the women accused of witchcraft matter. Not because they were magical, not because they were rebels, but because they were ordinary people caught in extraordinary fear. Remembering them correctly means remembering how quietly harm can occur, how politely it can be processed, how easily it can be forgotten. So if there's any ending here, and history resists endings, it's this slow recognition that the most important stories are not the loudest ones. They are the ones that nearly disappeared. And on that calm, heavy note, we let the story rest.
All right, welcome back. This part is slower, longer, more stretched out. Nothing urgent happens here, which is exactly the point. Because once witch trials ended, history didn't wrap things up neatly. There was no curtain call, no moment where everyone agreed on what had gone wrong. Instead, life continued, quietly, awkwardly. And that continuation is where many of the most important details live. When a woman accused of witchcraft survived, whether through acquittal, dismissal, or sheer exhaustion of the courts, she didn't step into a new chapter. She stepped back into the same one. Same town, same paths, same people. Just altered. Now imagine that return. There is no celebration, no crowd welcoming her back. At best, there is polite distance. At worst, silence thick enough to feel physical. Neighbors who once borrowed salt now avoid eye contact. Children are gently pulled away. Not because anyone says she is guilty anymore, but because certainty is comforting and doubt is not. People don't know what to do with an innocent woman who was once accused, so they do nothing. And doing nothing can last a lifetime. Now let's slow down and talk about time. Years pass. Decades pass. The accusation fades from active conversation, but it never fully disappears. It settles into memory, into tone, into the way someone is described. She's quiet. She keeps to herself. These phrases sound harmless. They're not. They are echoes. Now, here's something the records show surprisingly often. Some women accused of witchcraft moved away. Not dramatically, not in protest. They simply left. To another town, another parish, another place where their names meant nothing. Which sounds hopeful, but also means erasure. New lives built on forgetting, on silence. And those lives rarely appear in history books. Because historians follow names, and these women left theirs behind. Now let's talk about families. Accusations didn't stop with the accused. Children were affected. Spouses, siblings. A daughter of an accused woman might struggle to marry. A son might be treated with suspicion. Guilt, even disproven guilt, was contagious. And yet, life went on anyway. People still worked. Harvests still happened. Church bells still rang. Which is deeply unsettling if you think about it for too long. Now let's pause and look at the officials. Judges, clergy, interrogators. What happened to them? Mostly, nothing. Some expressed regret later. Some quietly revised their opinions. Most simply continued their careers. Because systems rarely punish themselves. And this matters, because it shaped how witch trials were remembered. If those in power faced no consequences, then the trials became unfortunate errors rather than crimes. Errors are easier to forgive. Now let's drift into generational memory. Grandparents told stories. Parents edited them. Children forgot details. What happened to that woman? Oh, something unpleasant a long time ago. The specifics didn't survive. Only discomfort did. And discomfort doesn't motivate careful remembrance. Now here's a subtle but important shift. As witch trials faded, society didn't suddenly become rational.
It simply found new explanations for fear. Medical theories replaced magic. Moral theories replaced demons. People were still blamed for misfortune, just with updated vocabulary. Women labeled hysterical. The poor labeled degenerate. Outcasts labeled dangerous. Same mechanism, different words. Which brings us back to why remembering witch trials matters at all. Not as spectacle, not as horror, but as routine. Because witch trials were not constant terror, they were periodic disruptions in otherwise ordinary lives. That's why people tolerated them. They happened, and then they stopped. And then they happened somewhere else, which made them easier to forget. Now let's talk about historians again, the modern ones. When historians began seriously re-examining witch trials, many were surprised by how mundane the records were. So much waiting, so much repetition, so many questions asked slightly differently over and over. No drama, no clarity, just process. And process is boring, which is why it's dangerous. Because boredom allows harm to hide. Now let's gently think about the women again. One last long look. They didn't know they were part of a historical phenomenon. They didn't know their experiences would be analyzed centuries later. They were responding in real time, to fear, to confusion, trying to say the right thing, trying to survive. Some complied, some resisted. Neither guaranteed safety, and that uncertainty stayed with them, long after trials ended. Now let's slow this down even further. Imagine being old, very old, years after an accusation. People around you no longer mention it, but you remember. You remember the cell, the questioning, the waiting, and you wonder, quietly, how close it all came. That thought doesn't leave you. It becomes part of how you see the world. Cautiously, carefully. And this is where the story gently dissolves, not into meaning, not into justice, but into ordinary time. Days passing, seasons changing, history moving forward without resolving itself, which is exactly how most history works. Now, before we end this part, there's one final observation worth sitting with. Witch trials didn't require monsters. They required participation. Small acts. Quiet agreements. People saying, well, maybe. People choosing not to intervene. And that participation wasn't loud. It was habitual. Routine. And routine is what made it sustainable. Now, as we ease towards the next and final part, we won't be looking for lessons. We won't be drawing warnings in bold letters. We'll simply sit with the pattern. How fear becomes administrative. How injustice becomes normalized. How time smooths over harm without fixing it. So take a deep breath. Let your thoughts slow. The story isn't ending yet. It's just continuing.
All right. If you're still here, good. That means the pace is working. Nothing sharp, nothing loud. Just a long, steady drift through the part of history that doesn't announce itself. Because Part 8 isn't really about witch trials anymore. Not directly. It's about the shape they left behind, and how that shape keeps reappearing even when we stop calling it witchcraft. Now, one of the most comforting lies modern societies tell themselves is this: that could never happen again. We say it calmly, confidently, as if witch trials were a glitch, a momentary lapse, a strange medieval error caused by superstition and ignorance. But when historians look closely, really closely, what they see isn't chaos. They see a system that worked exactly as intended. And that's the uncomfortable part. Witch trials were not random explosions of madness. They were structured responses to anxiety. And anxiety never goes away. It just changes topics. Let's slow down and examine how fear organizes itself. Fear doesn't begin loudly. It begins vaguely. Something feels wrong. Something feels unstable. Something feels out of control. People don't immediately ask why. They ask who. Who caused this? Who allowed this? Who benefits from this? And once a group is quietly labeled as suspicious, the rest becomes almost automatic. Now, during witch trials, the suspicious group was often women on the margins, widows, healers, the poor, people with limited protection. But the mechanism doesn't care who the target is, only that the target is available. And availability is everything. Availability means fewer defenders, fewer witnesses willing to speak up, fewer consequences for accusation. Now, here's where it gets very slow and very important. Most people involved in witch trials did not feel cruel. They felt responsible. They believed they were preventing harm, protecting their communities, doing what had to be done. And that belief made everything easier, because once harm is framed as prevention, it stops feeling like harm at all. This is why witch trials could coexist with ordinary kindness. People could accuse a woman in court and then help a neighbor carry firewood later that same day. Contradiction didn't bother them because the system told them it was consistent. Now let's talk about language. Language is where fear becomes respectable. During witch trials, words like examination, confession, evidence gave legitimacy to something deeply irrational. Modern societies use different words: risk, security, stability. But the effect is the same. Language creates distance. Distance makes harm manageable. Now let's gently return to the women accused of witchcraft one more time, because it's easy at this stage to zoom out too far, to lose them in theory. But they were not theories. They were individuals navigating a system they did not design and could not escape. And most of them never understood the full logic of that system. They experienced it in fragments: a look that lingered too long, a neighbor who stopped visiting, a question that felt slightly wrong. Fear arrives before accusation, and once it arrives, everything else rearranges around it. Now let's pause on something that often gets overlooked: resistance. People sometimes ask, why didn't more people resist witch trials? And the answer is very boring. Because resistance is expensive. Speaking up meant risking suspicion. Defending someone meant sharing their shadow.
And most people were already struggling. Hunger, disease, debt. They were not looking to add moral heroism to their list of responsibilities. So most people chose neutrality. And neutrality in systems like this always favors power. Now let's slow down again, because the real lesson of witch trials isn't about cruelty. It's about convenience. It was convenient to blame someone, convenient to believe accusations, convenient to let institutions handle fear for you, and convenience is persuasive. Now let's gently slide into the modern era. No dates, no headlines, just patterns. Every time a society faces uncertainty, economic instability, cultural change, technological disruption, it looks for simplified explanations. Someone must be responsible. Someone must be dangerous. And just like during witch trials, the accused are rarely those with power. They are people who already exist slightly outside the center. People whose absence would not disrupt the system. Now let's talk about memory again, because how we remember witch trials determines whether we recognize their echoes. If we remember them as absurd superstition, we miss the warning. If we remember them as pure evil, we distance ourselves too much. The truth is quieter. Witch trials were made possible by ordinary decision-making, by people choosing safety over solidarity, order over empathy. And that's why they're unsettling, because none of those choices feel extreme in the moment. Now imagine a woman accused of witchcraft watching all of this unfold. She does not see patterns, she sees consequences. Her world narrows, her choices shrink. She learns quickly that explaining herself doesn't help, that reason doesn't translate, that silence can be misinterpreted, and speech can be dangerous. And that lesson, that fear changes the rules, is something many people throughout history have learned the same way, quietly, painfully. Now let's slow this down even further, because we're approaching the emotional center of the story. The women accused of witchcraft were not sacrificed in moments of rage. They were worn down over time, by waiting, by repetition, by procedures that never quite resolved. And that slow erosion is harder to remember than sudden violence, but it matters more, because it's easier to repeat. Now let's think about what history does with slow suffering. It compresses it. Years become sentences, lives become summaries, and in that compression, the most important part is lost: the duration. How long fear lasts, how long suspicion lingers, how long innocence takes to stop mattering. Now let's bring this part gently toward rest. If there is anything the story of witch trials asks of us, it's not outrage. Outrage is loud, short-lived. It burns out quickly. What it asks for instead is attention. Attention to process, to language, to who benefits from fear. Attention to who becomes suspicious first and who is believed last. Because witch trials didn't begin with hatred. They began with discomfort. And discomfort is everywhere. So as we prepare to drift into the final part, the slowest one yet, we won't be looking for answers. We'll be looking for recognition. Not of witches, but of ourselves. Because history rarely repeats itself exactly. It repeats itself politely, with new vocabulary, and the same calm confidence. So take another deep breath. Let the room stay quiet. The story has one more stretch to go.
All right, this is part 9. And yes, this one is long, unhurried, intentionally stretched.
Nothing dramatic happens here either, which again is exactly the point. Because by now, we're no longer talking about witch trials as historical events. We're talking about them as habits. Habits societies never quite broke. So, let's settle in. When witch trials officially ended, people congratulated themselves. They believed something dangerous had been defeated. Superstition replaced by reason. Fear replaced by progress. And on paper, that was true. Courts stopped accepting witchcraft as a crime. Judges stopped asking about flying at night. The devil slowly lost his legal standing. But here's the quiet problem. The structure that made witch trials possible never disappeared. It simply went dormant. And dormant systems are far more dangerous than broken ones. Now, let's slow this way down. Because systems don't announce themselves when they reactivate. They don't say, "Hello, we're back." They slip into place gradually, using new language, new concerns, new threats. And everyone feels very reasonable the entire time. Let's start with suspicion. During witch trials, suspicion was moral. Someone felt wrong, and feelings were treated as evidence. Modern societies claim to value facts, data, proof. But suspicion still comes first. Something feels off. Someone seems dangerous. Someone doesn't belong. Evidence follows suspicion, not the other way around. And that's a direct inheritance from witch trial logic. Now, let's talk about visibility. Witch trials targeted people who were visible enough to notice, but invisible enough to defend. Widows, the poor, social outsiders. Modern systems do the same thing. They don't go after the powerful. They go after the accessible. People who lack resources. People with limited credibility. People already marked as difficult. Because accusation requires imbalance. Now here's something that feels uncomfortably familiar. During witch trials, once someone was accused, everything about them was reinterpreted. Silence meant guilt. Anger meant guilt. Fear meant guilt. There was no correct response. Modern accusations work the same way. Defend yourself too much and you're suspicious. Stay quiet and you're hiding something. The outcome is predetermined. The performance is just procedural. Now, let's slow down again, because this part matters. One of the most enduring legacies of witch trials is how they taught societies to outsource moral responsibility. People didn't say, "I think she's guilty." They said, "The court will decide," which allowed individuals to participate without feeling accountable. Modern systems still rely on this. It's policy, it's procedure, it's protocol. Words that allow harm to occur without ownership. Now, let's gently think about fear again. Fear is not always loud. Often it's administrative. It appears as forms, checklists, guidelines. Witch trials had manuals, rules, best practices. So does everything else. And manuals create the illusion of neutrality. Now, let's return one last time to the women themselves. Imagine one of them standing quietly at the edge of all this analysis. She doesn't recognize herself in the patterns. She doesn't think of herself as part of a legacy. She remembers only how it felt. The waiting, the uncertainty, the way people looked at her differently before anyone said anything out loud. Fear announces itself early. Now let's talk about boredom again, because boredom is key. Witch trials didn't survive on outrage. They survived on routine. Once they became routine, they stopped feeling wrong. Modern injustices function the same way. They don't shock us, they exhaust us, and exhaustion breeds acceptance. Now here's a slow, uncomfortable truth.
Most people involved in witch trials believed they were decent people. They loved their families, they helped neighbors, they prayed, and they participated anyway. Not because they were monsters, but because systems normalize participation, and normalization is powerful. Now, let's take a breath, because this part isn't meant to accuse, it's meant to observe. Observance is quieter than judgment. Now, let's gently move toward how witch trials are taught today. They're often framed as lessons already learned, mistakes already corrected, which allows us to feel safe. But safety built on forgetting is fragile, because forgetting removes context, and context is what helps us recognize patterns when they return. Now, let's slow this even more, because the women accused of witchcraft were not warning signs to their own society. They were background noise. Their suffering was inconvenient, their confusion uncomfortable, and inconvenience is easy to ignore. Now, let's bring this toward the present. Modern life is full of invisible threats, abstract dangers, systemic fears. And whenever fear becomes abstract, societies look for concrete targets, someone to point to, someone to isolate. And once again, the logic activates. Better safe than sorry. We can't take chances. It's for the greater good. These phrases are not new. They are ancient. Now, imagine explaining this to one of the accused women, telling her that centuries later people would still be discussing what happened to her. She might be surprised. She might be confused. She might ask a very simple question. Did they understand? And the honest answer would be, partially. We understand the facts, the mechanisms, the outcomes. But understanding emotionally takes longer, because it requires admitting how ordinary all of it was. Now, let's slow everything down to its final pace. Because this story does not want to end with clarity. It wants to end with awareness. Witch trials did not require belief in magic. They required belief in authority, in narrative, in fear management. And those beliefs never disappeared. They just changed costumes. Now, as we prepare for the final part, the last long drift, we won't resolve anything. We'll simply sit with the knowledge that history does not repeat loudly. It repeats calmly, professionally, with signatures at the bottom of the page. So, take one more deep breath. Let the room stay quiet. The story has one final, very slow step left to take.
All right, this is part 10, the last stretch. And as promised, this one takes its time. There is no climax waiting here, no final revelation, no neat conclusion tied with a ribbon. Instead, this part does what history usually does when no one is watching. It lingers. So settle in. Let your breathing slow. Let the room stay dim. Now, when historians talk about the end of witch trials, they often point to dates, a final execution, a last court case, a law quietly repealed. These moments exist, they are real, but socially, emotionally, culturally, nothing actually ended. Because belief systems don't shut off like lights. They dim, they flicker, they leave shadows. And shadows are where habits survive. Let's start with memory. Communities remembered witch trials in a very specific way, not as cruelty, not as injustice, but as embarrassment. And embarrassment is dangerous, because embarrassed societies don't investigate themselves deeply. They look away, they minimize. They say things like, "It was a different time," which is true, and also insufficient. Now imagine a town centuries later. The buildings are different, the roads wider, the language modern, but the land remembers. Somewhere,
beneath ordinary footsteps, are places where people once gathered to accuse, to watch, to decide. No plaques, no markers, just absence. And absence has weight. Now let's slow this down even more, because what lingers longest isn't belief in witchcraft, it's belief in deservingness. The idea that suffering must have a reason, that misfortune needs a culprit, that chaos is unacceptable. Witch trials offered answers, bad ones, but answers nonetheless. And when those answers disappeared, the need for explanation didn't. So societies adapted. Illness became moral failure. Poverty became personal weakness. Difference became threat. Same instinct, new vocabulary. Now let's think again about the women at the center of all this. Not as symbols, not as lessons, as people. They did not see themselves as participants in a historic tragedy. They were trying to survive ordinary days. They worried about food, about children, about weather. And then, suddenly, they worried about survival itself. That abrupt shift from normal life to existential danger is one of the most under-discussed aspects of witch trials, because it was disorienting. One day, you were a neighbor. The next, a possibility. Not guilty, not innocent, just suspicious. Now imagine carrying that feeling forward, even after acquittal, even after release. Once your identity has been questioned publicly, it never fully resets. And that is a quiet cruelty. Now let's drift outward again, because witch trials weren't just about women, they were about trust. Communities learned how quickly trust could dissolve, how easily rumor could outrun truth, how fast fear could reorganize social bonds. And once learned, those lessons stuck. People became cautious, reserved, less willing to defend others loudly, because defense carried risk. Silence felt safer. Now let's pause here. Silence is not neutral. Silence is a decision. And during witch trials, silence kept things moving smoothly, which is why silence shows up again and again in modern systems of harm. Not loud agreement, just quiet compliance. Now let's talk to historians one last time. The people who dig through records, who read trial transcripts line by line, who notice how often the same phrases repeat. They don't usually describe witch trials as chaos. They describe them as orderly, procedural, which is unsettling because it suggests that injustice doesn't require disorder. It requires organization. And organization feels responsible, adult, reasonable. Now let's sit with that thought. Because most of the people involved in witch trials believed they were maintaining order. They believed they were protecting communities, preserving morality, preventing worse harm. Intentions don't erase outcomes, but they do explain participation. And understanding participation matters. Now we reach the slowest part of all. The question people always ask, how could this happen? And the answer, the uncomfortable answer, is that nothing extraordinary was required. No mass hysteria, no collective madness, just fear, routine, and permission. Permission to suspect, permission to accuse, permission to look away. Now imagine telling this story without flames, without screaming, without spectacle, just paperwork, waiting, repetition. That's the version closest to reality. And it's harder to process because it doesn't allow us to distance ourselves. There are no villains with dramatic music, just people doing what seemed acceptable at the time. Now let's gently return to the present. Witch trials are often used as metaphors now, as warnings, but metaphors can soften reality. They turn lived experiences into symbols, and symbols are easier to handle than people.
So let's not end with a metaphor. Let's end with presence. Somewhere in archives there are names. Handwritten, misspelled, crossed out. Names of women who lived full lives before accusation and partial lives afterward. They don't demand justice now. They don't ask for recognition. They simply exist. And acknowledging that existence, without sensationalism, without resolution, is enough. Now take another slow breath. The story does not conclude. It fades, like memory, like habit, like the echo of something unresolved. And that's where we leave it. Not finished, just quiet. You can let your thoughts drift now. The past will stay where it is, waiting.
All right. This is part 11. We're still here, still moving slowly. Nothing new begins in this part. Instead, things sink. So take a breath. Let your shoulders relax. This is one of those stretches where history stops talking loudly and starts sitting beside you instead. Now, there's something strange about how societies remember events like witch trials. They don't remember them continuously. They remember them in waves. A burst of interest, a documentary, a book, a classroom lesson, and then quiet again. Silence is the default state of history. Most of the time, the past is not actively remembered or actively forgotten. It's simply not referenced, which is how uncomfortable truths survive without being addressed. Witch trials live in that space. Everyone knows they happened. Few people sit with what that actually meant on a daily basis. Because daily reality is dull, and dull suffering doesn't hold attention well. Now let's slow down even more. Think about how long these events lasted. Not the executions, not the accusations, the waiting. Weeks, months, sometimes years. People existed in a suspended state, not knowing whether their lives would resume or quietly end. That kind of uncertainty reshapes a person, and it doesn't go away just because the danger does. Now imagine surviving that. Imagine living long enough to watch society move on. People stop whispering. New concerns replace old ones. The town finds something else to worry about. And you're still there, carrying a memory no one wants to revisit. That's the emotional afterlife of witch trials, and it's rarely discussed. Now let's talk about emotional inheritance. Trauma doesn't stay neatly contained within one person. It seeps outward. Children notice how parents flinch at authority, how they avoid attention, how they speak carefully. Those behaviors get passed down, not as stories, as habits. Which means witch trials didn't just affect individuals, they shaped family dynamics for generations. Caution became wisdom, silence became safety, visibility became risk. These lessons outlasted belief in witches. Now let's pause here, because this is where the story becomes very quiet. No records capture this part well, no transcripts, no court documents, just patterns. Patterns historians notice centuries later and think, that's interesting. But for the people living it, it was simply life. Now let's drift outward again. As Enlightenment thinking spread, witch trials became embarrassing footnotes, evidence of a less rational past. This framing did something subtle. It allowed modern societies to feel superior. And feeling superior reduces vigilance, because if you believe you're smarter than the past, you stop looking for its mistakes in the present. That confidence is comforting and dangerous. Now let's slow this thought down. Every society believes it is more reasonable than the one before it. Every society believes its systems are safeguards, not threats.
Witch trials happened under people who believed the same thing. That doesn't mean progress isn't real. It is. But progress does not erase human behavior, it reorganizes it. Now let's talk about fear again. Not panic, not hysteria. Low-level fear. The kind that hums in the background. Fear of instability, fear of disorder, fear of things that can't be neatly explained. Witch trials gave that fear a shape. When that shape disappeared, fear didn't vanish, it just went looking for something else. And it always finds something. Now imagine explaining this to someone living through a trial, telling them that centuries later people would debate mechanisms and systems. They might nod politely, but they would probably still want to know one thing. Why me? And that question never gets answered. Because witch trials weren't about individuals, they were about conditions. Wrong place, wrong time, wrong social position. Meaning was assigned after the fact. Now let's slow this to its most gentle pace, because we're approaching the kind of silence that comes after long explanation. At some point, analysis stops being helpful. Understanding reaches its limit, and all that's left is acknowledgement. Acknowledging that ordinary people suffered under ordinary systems. That cruelty didn't need passion, just permission. Now let's think about modern remembrance. Museums, memorials, educational programs. These are important, they matter. But they often focus on the most dramatic elements. The executions, the spectacle, which unintentionally hides the most relevant part. The normalcy. The fact that life continued alongside injustice. That people adapted, that routines absorbed harm. That's harder to teach, harder to sit with. Now let's return, gently, to boredom. Boredom is not absence of meaning, it's absence of urgency. Witch trials became possible because people were not constantly outraged. They were busy, tired, preoccupied. And tired societies accept things they would otherwise resist. That lesson never stopped being relevant. Now take another slow breath. There's no final takeaway coming, no summary. This part exists to let the weight settle. To remind us that history doesn't end with realization, it ends with continuation. People wake up the next day, they work, they eat, they worry about small things. And somewhere beneath that ordinariness are unresolved stories, unfinished reckonings. Now imagine history as a room, not dramatic, just quiet. Chairs slightly out of place, dust in corners. Nothing screaming for attention, everything waiting to be noticed. Witch trials sit in that room, not demanding, not loud, just present. And presence is enough. So we don't end this part with a lesson, we end it with stillness. Let the silence do the work. History will remain, patient, unresolved. And that, more than anything else, is the truth it leaves behind.
All right, this is part 12. We're easing toward the end now, but not rushing. Nothing is being wrapped up quickly here. This part is a little shorter than the last few, but still long enough to settle into. Still slow, still calm. So get comfortable again. Now, one of the strangest things about history, especially something like witch trials, is how easily it becomes background knowledge. People know about it, they recognize the word, they vaguely understand it was bad, and then they move on. That movement is subtle, almost unconscious, because knowing something happened feels a lot like dealing with it, even when it isn't. Witch trials exist in that strange space where awareness replaces responsibility, and that's worth sitting with. Now imagine the last people who still remembered the trials firsthand, the ones who were children when accusations happened,
who overheard conversations, who saw adults behave differently overnight. As they aged, they became the last witnesses, not to executions, but to atmosphere. They remembered tension, whispering, careful speech, and when they died, that atmosphere went with them. What remained were documents, dates, numbers, useful but incomplete, because records don't capture hesitation or the way fear subtly rearranges daily life. Now let's slow this even more. There's a temptation to search for meaning in suffering, to believe that pain must produce wisdom. But suffering doesn't guarantee insight. It only guarantees endurance. Many of the women accused of witchcraft didn't become symbols. They didn't become teachers. They simply survived, or didn't. And survival is not the same as resolution. Now think about how modern people engage with this history. Through books read late at night, through documentaries half-watched while doing something else, through short summaries. Even long videos, like the one this script is meant for, are still consumption, and consumption creates distance. Distance can be useful, but it can also soften impact. Now let's return, briefly, to something we haven't talked about much: forgiveness. There is very little evidence that societies formally asked for forgiveness for witch trials. There were no apologies issued centuries later, no collective acknowledgments. Instead, silence did the work. Silence allowed the past to fade without confrontation. And fading feels easier than accountability. Now imagine the accused women hearing modern discussions about them. They might be surprised by the interest, confused by the terminology. They didn't experience misogyny or mass hysteria as concepts. They experienced fear, isolation, confusion. And translating lived pain into theory is always imperfect, necessary, but imperfect. Now let's think about something very human: closure. People like closure. Stories like closure. Witch trials don't offer it. There's no final moment where everything makes sense, no clear line between ignorance and enlightenment, just a gradual shift, beliefs losing credibility, practices becoming unacceptable. That kind of ending feels unsatisfying, which is why we often rewrite it in our heads. We prefer a clean break, a lesson learned, but reality rarely cooperates. Now let's slow the pace again. History is not a teacher that waits for understanding. It moves on regardless. People forget details. They simplify narratives. They compress decades into sentences. And compression removes texture. Texture is where discomfort lives. Now think again about boredom. By now, if you're listening to this as intended, you might feel a little numb. That's not accidental. Witch trials weren't sustained by constant terror. They were sustained by emotional fatigue. People got used to them. And that getting used to feeling is deeply unsettling, because it suggests that attention, not belief, is the real limiter of harm. Now let's drift outward one last time. Witch trials are often used as a warning about superstition, but superstition wasn't the engine. Authority was, fear management was, social conformity was. Those things didn't disappear, they evolved, which means this history isn't distant, it's adjacent, not repeating itself exactly, but rhyming quietly. Now let's bring this part toward rest. Not an ending, just a pause. The women accused of witchcraft don't ask us to fix the past. That's impossible. They don't ask for outrage, or even remembrance on a grand scale. What their stories ask for, indirectly, quietly, is attention. Not dramatic attention, just sustained noticing. Noticing how easily systems drift, how quickly fear becomes procedure, how ordinary people participate without realizing it. And noticing doesn't require action right now. It requires awareness, which is slow and unexciting and hard to maintain. Now take a final slow breath for this part. Let the thoughts settle wherever they land. The story continues beyond this, but for now, we let it rest here, unfinished,
unresolved and quietly present.
All right, this is part 13. We're not accelerating. We're not concluding. We're simply staying. If you're listening the way this is meant to be heard, your mind may drift in and out here. That's fine. That's appropriate. Because this part is about what remains when attention thins out. History, especially uncomfortable history, doesn't live in sharp focus forever. It settles into a low hum. Present, but easy to ignore. Witch trials did that. They didn't vanish. They became background. And background is powerful. Now let's begin with something very small. Language. Long after witch trials ended, the language stayed. Words like witch hunt, hysteria, moral panic. These phrases sound metaphorical now, almost casual. But metaphors have origins, and origins have weight. Using the language without the memory makes it lighter, less grounded, safer to toss around. And safety here comes from distance. Now let's slow this down. Distance is not forgetting, it's softening. It allows people to feel informed without feeling implicated. And that feeling, I know about this, therefore I'm separate from it, is comforting. But separation is an illusion. Now imagine a society centuries after witch trials, comfortable, confident, certain it has moved beyond such things. That certainty is what allows similar dynamics to return quietly. Not with fire, not with shouting, with paperwork, with policy, with concern. Concern is especially effective. Because concern sounds kind. Now let's talk about concern. During witch trials, concern was everywhere. Concern for souls, concern for community safety, concern for moral decay. Concern justified investigation. Investigation justified suspicion. Suspicion justified punishment. And punishment, once normalized, required no further explanation. Concern is gentle. Concern feels responsible, which is why it's dangerous when left unquestioned. Now let's return to the individuals again. One of the most striking things in trial records is how often accused women expressed confusion, not outrage, not defiance, confusion. They didn't understand how ordinary actions became evidence, how gestures became signs, how relationships became liabilities. Confusion drains energy. It makes resistance harder. And confused people rely on systems to clarify things. That reliance was exploited. Now let's slow the pace again. Confusion isn't accidental. It's a byproduct of complexity layered onto fear. When rules are unclear and consequences are severe, people freeze, and frozen populations are manageable. Now think about how that lesson traveled forward. Modern systems are complex, procedures opaque, accountability diffused. People often don't know who decides things or how, and in that uncertainty, people comply. Not because they agree, but because they don't see alternatives. That's not witchcraft, but the structure is familiar. Now let's talk about time again. Time does not heal history, it reorganizes it. Events lose emotional sharpness. They become lessons, examples, case studies. And case studies feel contained. But the emotional residue doesn't disappear, it disperses. Into cultural instincts, into inherited caution, into normalized silence. Now imagine being a descendant of someone accused, not knowing details, just knowing something bad happened. Family stories that trail off, a reluctance to talk about certain places, a general distrust of authority that no one explains.
That's history moving quietly through generations, not as narrative, as mood. Now let's pause. Mood is difficult to document, harder to measure, which is why it's often dismissed. But mood shapes behavior more consistently than facts. Witch trials left a mood behind, suspicion mixed with resignation, and that mood survived the belief itself. Now let's gently consider education. Most people learn about witch trials briefly, as a warning, as an example of superstition gone wrong. This framing implies a solved problem, but solved problems don't need attention, and attention is what prevents repetition. Now slow this thought down. The danger is not believing in witches. The danger is believing systems are incapable of such errors anymore. That belief invites complacency, and complacency is how patterns return without announcement. Now let's talk about responsibility. During witch trials, responsibility was diffuse. Accusers blamed judges, judges blamed doctrine, doctrine blamed fear of evil. No one felt personally responsible, and systems thrive on that diffusion. Modern injustices often work the same way. Responsibility spread thin becomes responsibility denied. Now imagine asking someone involved in a trial, "Do you feel guilty?" They might honestly say no. They followed rules, they trusted authority, they acted within accepted norms. Guilt requires reflection, reflection requires space, and during times of fear, space disappears. Now let's breathe. This part isn't here to accuse anyone living now. It's here to observe continuity. Patterns don't need villains, they need momentum. Now let's drift towards something very quiet. Ordinary days. Most days during witch trials were ordinary. People woke up, worked, ate meals. Extraordinary cruelty coexisted with routine life. And that coexistence is what makes this history relevant. Because modern life is also ordinary, and harm often hides there. Not in moments of crisis, but in daily decisions left unexamined. Now let's slow even further. If this feels repetitive, that's intentional. Witch trials were repetitive. Accusation, questioning, waiting, again and again. Normalization numbs moral response. And now imagine the end of a trial day. People go home, light candles, talk about weather. The accused sits alone somewhere, waiting. That contrast between normalcy and isolation is one of the quietest forms of cruelty, and it rarely makes it into summaries. Now let's bring this part gently toward rest. Not an ending, just a settling. Witch trials don't ask us to panic. They don't demand urgency centuries later. They ask us to notice how easily societies slide into certainty, how quickly fear becomes justified, how calmly harm can proceed. Not with shouting, but with paperwork, with concern, with good intentions. Now take a slow breath. If your mind wanders, let it. That wandering is part of staying. The past isn't asking to be solved, it's asking not to be dismissed. And dismissal often happens through speed. So we stay slow, we stay quiet, we let the unfinished remain unfinished. Because sometimes the most honest way to remember is not to conclude at all.
All right, this is part 14. We're still not rushing, still not trimming anything down. This part is meant to sprawl a little, to take up space. So settle back in. By now, the witch trials themselves may feel distant, not gone, but softened, like something you understand intellectually, even if it no longer feels sharp. That softening is exactly what this part is about.
Because history doesn't disappear when it fades. It becomes ordinary. And ordinary things are the hardest to question. Now let's begin somewhere quiet. Imagine a town years after its last witch trial. No one talks about it anymore. Not because it's forbidden, but because it's awkward. The people involved are gone. The urgency has passed. Life has rearranged itself around the absence. The market still opens. Children still grow up. New problems demand attention. And in that continuation, something subtle happens. The trial becomes something that happened once, instead of something that was allowed to happen. That shift matters, because something that happened feels external, accidental, unavoidable. But something that was allowed implies choice, participation, consent. And societies are very good at avoiding that second framing. Now let's slow this down. Avoidance doesn't look dramatic, it looks practical. People say things like, "There was no way they could have known better." Sometimes that's true. Sometimes it's convenient. Most of the time, it's both. Now let's think about belief again. One of the comforting myths about witch trials is that they were driven by belief in magic. That once belief faded, the danger disappeared. But belief wasn't the engine, belief was the justification. The engine was fear combined with authority. And authority didn't vanish when belief changed. It simply found new explanations. Now let's drift gently into the idea of normality. Normality is not neutral, it's constructed. What feels normal is what we see often, what we tolerate repeatedly, what stops triggering reaction. During witch trials, suspicion became normal. Questioning neighbors became normal. Waiting for verdicts became normal. And once normality sets in, morality quiets down. Not because people stop caring, but because caring constantly is exhausting. Now imagine living in that environment. You might not approve of everything, but you adapt. You lower your voice. You avoid certain topics. You don't ask questions you don't want answers to. That adaptation is not cowardice, it's survival. And survival shapes behavior more reliably than ethics. Now let's pause, because this is where history becomes uncomfortable. Not because of what people believed, but because of how understandable their choices were. It's easy to condemn cruelty when it's dramatic, harder when it's incremental. Witch trials were incremental, small suspicions piling up, minor accusations escalating, ordinary procedures repeated. And repetition removes shock. All right, this is part 15. Still slow, still unhurried, no shortcuts. If you're settling in, that's good. This part isn't trying to teach, it's trying to sit. Because by now, the witch trials are no longer an event in this story. They're a condition, a background presence. And conditions are harder to talk about than events. Events start and stop. Conditions just exist. Now let's begin with something deceptively simple. Time. Time did not heal the damage caused by witch trials. It redistributed it. Pain spread out. Responsibility thinned. Memory softened. And when memory softens, urgency dissolves. That's not moral failure. It's human behavior. Humans are not designed to hold sharp grief indefinitely. We smooth it down so we can function. And societies do the same thing, just on a larger scale. Now imagine a community generations later. No one alive remembers the trials, the accusations, the fear. But the social instincts remain. People still know who belongs,
Who is tolerated? Who should stay quiet? No one can explain why. It's just how things are. That's history operating without a narrative. Now let's slow down. There's a common assumption that if people forget history, it disappears. But forgetting doesn't erase influence. It removes context. And influence without context is dangerous, because people follow instincts they can't explain. Now let's think again about accusation. Witch trials normalized a very specific idea, that harm could be prevented by identifying threats early. Early identification feels proactive, responsible, protective, and it's a powerful idea, because it frames suspicion as virtue. If you question someone, you're vigilant. If you doubt them, you're cautious. If you accuse them, you're brave. This logic survived the end of witch trials. It just found new targets. Now let's pause, because this is where discomfort quietly enters. Not with guilt, not with blame, but with recognition. The same reasoning patterns still feel reasonable today, and that's unsettling. Now let's drift back to the people who lived through the trials. Many of them didn't leave written accounts. They weren't asked to reflect. History doesn't preserve the voices of those who were simply relieved it was over. Relief doesn't produce documents. Relief produces silence. And silence is difficult to interpret. Was it peace or exhaustion? Probably both. Now let's slow even more. Exhaustion is one of the least acknowledged forces in history. People don't revolt when they're tired. They don't analyze deeply. They adapt. Witch trials benefited from exhaustion. Long processes, endless questioning, waiting without information. People stopped resisting not because they were convinced, but because they were worn down. And worn down populations are easier to manage. Now think about how that lesson carried forward. Complex systems, slow procedures, delayed outcomes. Fatigue becomes compliance. Again, not through malice, through mechanics. Now let's talk about morality. During witch trials, morality was externalized. People didn't ask, is this right? They asked, is this permitted? Permission replaced conscience. And permission is comforting, because it removes personal risk. Now imagine someone centuries later reading about witch trials and saying, I would never have participated. Maybe, maybe not. Because participation often doesn't feel like participation at the time. It feels like attendance, like paperwork, like silence. Now let's breathe. This isn't about accusing the present. It's about understanding continuity. Understanding that systems don't require belief to function. They require acceptance. And acceptance is quieter than belief. Now let's shift towards something even subtler. Normalization. Normalization doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with banners or speeches. It arrives when something stops feeling strange, when questions stop being asked, when routines solidify. During witch trials, once accusations became routine, the moral shock faded. That's when harm becomes sustainable. Now imagine the moment after that shift. Not dramatic, just ordinary. People going about their day with an added layer of quiet caution. That's the moment history rarely records, but it's the moment that matters most. Now let's slow the pace again.
At this point in the series, you might be waiting for something new. A new angle. A final insight. There isn't one. Because history like this doesn't offer revelation. It offers accumulation. Small realizations stacking slowly. And accumulation takes time. Now let's consider how witch trials are used in conversation today. Often as shorthand. As bad as a witch hunt. That turned into a witch trial. These phrases imply exaggeration, absurdity. But the original trials weren't absurd to the people living through them. They were structured, authorized, normalized. And reducing them to metaphors risks trivializing the mechanisms that made them possible. Now let's think about justice. Justice implies resolution. Witch trials didn't end with justice. They ended with abandonment. Societies moved on. Victims were rarely acknowledged. And acknowledgement matters. Not because it fixes the past, but because it shapes how the future handles discomfort. Now let's slow again. There's a temptation to believe that naming something prevents it. That if we call out injustice, it can't return. But naming is only the beginning. Attention must follow. And attention is expensive. It requires energy, focus, discomfort, which is why attention fades. Now imagine the last people who still felt personal guilt over witch trials. Not public guilt, private guilt. They likely never spoke about it. Guilt doesn't always seek expression. Sometimes it just changes behavior. Avoidance, withdrawal, silence. And those behaviors get passed on too. Not as stories, as atmosphere. Now let's pause again. Atmosphere is hard to describe, but easy to feel. Witch trials left an atmosphere behind. Caution, distrust, deference, and atmospheres linger. Now let's drift toward the present one last time. Modern societies are complex, overstimulated, busy. People don't have time to analyze every system they participate in. And systems don't require full agreement, just enough cooperation. That was true then. It's true now. Now let's slow to the quietest pace yet. This part isn't meant to conclude anything. It's meant to reinforce a single idea. Very gently. History doesn't repeat because people forget facts. It repeats because structures feel familiar. Because behaviors feel normal. Because participation feels harmless in isolation. Now take a slow breath. Let the thoughts blur slightly. You don't need to hold everything clearly. The past isn't asking to be mastered. It's asking to be noticed. Even when it's boring. Even when it refuses to resolve. And that noticing, quiet, sustained, unremarkable, is where this story continues. Not with an ending, just with awareness.
All right. This is part 16. We're still moving, but barely. The pace stays gentle, almost floating. If you've been listening through all of this, you might feel like the story has already ended several times. That's understandable. But history doesn't end. It just loses volume. And this part lives in that low volume space. Now let's start with something deceptively calm.
After witch trials faded from legality and public attention, societies didn't pause to reflect. They didn't gather to ask what had gone wrong. They didn't redesign themselves. They adjusted, quietly. Adjustments are easier than transformations. People stopped using certain words, stopped asking certain questions, stopped accusing people of specific things, but the emotional infrastructure remained intact. Fear still needed management. Uncertainty still demanded explanation. Difference still felt uncomfortable. Those needs didn't disappear. They were simply rerouted. Now let's slow down and look at rerouting. Rerouting doesn't feel like repetition. It feels like progress. New explanations sound smarter, more modern, less embarrassing, which makes them harder to question. Now imagine a society proud of having outgrown witch trials. It points to science, to rationalism, to law, all of which are real improvements. But improvement does not eliminate vulnerability. It rearranges it. Every system has pressure points. Every society has moments of fear. And fear looks for permission. Now let's think about permission again. During witch trials, permission came from authority figures, clergy, judges, community leaders. Once authority legitimized fear, individuals followed. That dynamic did not vanish. Authority still shapes what fears are acceptable, what suspicions are reasonable, what actions are justified. And authority rarely needs to command loudly. A suggestion is often enough. Now let's breathe. Because this isn't an argument against authority. It's an observation about influence. Influence is subtle, often invisible to those under it. Now let's return briefly to the idea of innocence. One of the most tragic aspects of witch trials is that innocence did not protect people. And that reality unsettles us, because we want to believe innocence is a shield. But innocence requires recognition, and recognition requires power. Without power, innocence is fragile. That lesson did not disappear with witch trials. It remains embedded in how societies treat vulnerability. Now let's slow again. Think about how often people today are asked to prove harmlessness, to demonstrate compliance, to reassure others. That expectation echoes the past, not in content, in structure. Now imagine one of the accused women hearing all this analysis. She might listen patiently. She might not recognize the abstractions. What she would recognize is this: the feeling of being evaluated, the sense of being watched, the exhaustion of never quite knowing what will satisfy the questioners. Those feelings are timeless. Now let's pause. Exhaustion deserves more attention than it gets. People often imagine resistance as heroic, loud, defiant. But most resistance fails quietly due to fatigue. Witch trials exploited fatigue masterfully. Long interrogations, repeated questioning, endless waiting. People complied not because they were convinced, but because they were tired. And tired people choose relief over justice. Now let's think about relief. Relief is powerful. Ending uncertainty feels like mercy, even when the outcome is unfair. Which is why confessions happened, why compliance increased, and why systems learned that pressure works. Now let's drift outward again. As centuries passed, witch trials became stories, cautionary tales. But stories have edges, beginnings, endings. Reality does not. Reality is messy, lingering, unresolved. Turning witch trials into stories gave them boundaries they never had, which made them feel safer. Now let's slow this down. Safety is often created by distance. The further something feels from us, the easier it is to believe we've outgrown it. But emotional mechanisms don't age the way technology does. Fear still accelerates decision-making. Authority still calms doubt. Belonging still influences judgment. These are constants. Now imagine a modern person saying, "That could never happen now." They might be sincere. They might be wrong. Because that never happens the same way twice. It adapts. Now let's breathe again. This part isn't trying to convince. It's trying to notice. Notice how calmly societies move forward after harm. How little disruption injustice causes once it becomes normalized. That calm continuation is the real legacy. Now let's think about how people remember themselves. Very few people involved in witch trials saw themselves as villains. They saw themselves as cautious, responsible, protective. And self-image matters. People rarely act against their self-image. They reinterpret actions to preserve it. That's not historical. That's human. Now let's slow further. Imagine the end of a long day during a trial period. People go home, eat dinner, talk quietly. No one feels dramatic. No one feels evil. Life continues. And continuation dulls reflection. Now let's return to the present moment of listening. If this feels repetitive, that's intentional. Repetition mirrors reality. Witch trials weren't shocking every day. They were predictable. Predictability breeds acceptance, and acceptance is the most powerful stabilizer of harm. Now let's consider something uncomfortable. Many systems only change when they become inefficient, not when they become immoral. Witch trials declined partly because they were expensive, time-consuming, legally messy, not purely because they were unjust. That reality complicates moral narratives. Now let's pause. This doesn't mean morality doesn't matter. It means morality alone is often insufficient. Change requires pressure, costs, inconvenience, which is why injustice can persist when it's easy. Now let's slow even more. Ease is seductive. Easy procedures, clear targets, simple explanations. Witch trials offered all three, and humans prefer simplicity during fear. Now imagine fear returning. Not the same fear, but a familiar one. Uncertainty, instability, loss of control. Those conditions activate old instincts, and unless examined, those instincts guide action. Now let's take another breath. This part isn't pessimistic, it's cautious. Caution is not despair, it's awareness without panic. Now let's gently approach the end of this part. Not a conclusion, just a resting place. Witch trials didn't teach humanity a single lesson. They revealed tendencies. Tendencies towards suspicion, towards deference, towards simplifying fear by assigning blame. Those tendencies didn't vanish. They wait. Not aggressively, patiently. Now let the pace slow completely. History doesn't demand constant attention. It waits until attention fades. And when attention fades, patterns have room to breathe. So we keep noticing, quietly, without urgency. Because urgency burns out, but awareness endures. And endurance, slow, steady, unremarkable, is the only thing that ever changes how history moves. That's where we leave part 16. Not resolved, not concluded, just continuing.